Hello, and welcome to the first episode of How to Go. Um, in this episode, I'm going to be talking mostly about basic opening theory. A lot of my lectures that I give at clubs or when people ask me questions is related to how do I play the opening, or what should I be focusing on the opening, or I'm really lost in the opening. These are kind of comments I hear a lot. It kind of makes sense too, because in the end game, there's a clear goal of like, I need to get more points, I need to count and reduce. In the middle game, there's this kind of like more ambiguous, but still kind of clear. I don't want to die. I want to kill him. I want this area. I want to take away this area from my opponent. The opening is more ambiguous, where it's like, well, where should I play? Should I play in this region? Should I go over here? It's a little more ambiguous, and so I wanted to make this video to kind of address that kind of topic. This video is probably most suited for low to mid queue players, maybe a couple of high queue players, but it might be reviewed for some. But even if you know this already, you might not have heard it explained this way, so I hope it's still somewhat informative and useful. Okay, so let's begin by looking at discerning the difference between a fourth line stone and a third line stone. And to do this, I'm going to use the 3-4 point, or komaku, to talk about this. So it's called the 3-4 point because it's 4 lines up from one side and 3 lines up from the other side. Okay, so the first question I have is, what direction does this stone want to develop next? A lot of times you hear players talk about when giving reviews or a critique, they're saying, oh, you're approaching from the wrong direction, or oh, this move is in the wrong direction, you're falling behind, and it's kind of ambiguous, or more like a convention of how people talk about the game, but it could be kind of overwhelming for new players. So first off, would you rather play in the A top region, top of the board, or the B region, the right side of the board, so as to develop the upper right 3-4 stone? Most players understand that the top side is bigger, but they might not understand why it's bigger. They will say, oh, you should enclose here to make an enclosure. This is probably the first enclosure people learn, the most typical shape. You might also know, you might also play the large, nice enclosure, or even like a Chinese, not an enclosure, but an extension. You very rarely will see people play here or here, but this video is kind of addressing why that's the case. So if we look at the stone just by itself, and we consider, well, I want to move from this stone. One second, my mouse is breaking. Let's say you do a one space jump. Then you're enclosing, or you're kind of controlling 3 lines of, not quite territory, but 3 lines of space beneath the fourth line stone. This is important because the fourth line stone has less of a grip on territory, but it allows you to cover more space. And in terms of development, it's usually better to develop from the fourth line stone. In comparison, we can talk about a one space jump in the other direction. Here. This move only covers 2 lines of territory, or space, and only develops from the third line stone. If we talk about development, then we say that usually, because it's more efficient for just one move, it's the same relationship too, right? It's just a one space jump. But for the one move, it's more efficient for black to play towards the top side from this 3-4 point, to play in this direction, because it makes use of the fact that it's 4 lines from the side, and so can cover more space. Now, this might seem like a fairly small thing because it's just 1 line difference, but if you look, let's take a very easy example. Let's look at a board position that looks like this, and we could say, oh, what if black plays this move, approaching the corner from the so-called wrong direction, right? White responds with 1 space jump, and then black backs off somehow. And then we can make a similar formation in this corner, right? White approaches the black stone, backs off, the same shape. So these two shapes are, lagging a bit. This upper right white shape and this bottom left black shape are the same, so they have the same efficiency. But the two black stones are clearly worse than the two white stones here, because these two black stones only encompass 2 lines of space beneath them, because they're third line stones, while the white stones over here encompass 4 lines of space because they're fourth line stones. So these two stones are acting much more efficiently than these two black stones over here. So we can say that the proper direction for this upper right black stone is, again, the top side. Now, we might consider another type, very common opening move is the 4-4 point. It might seem obvious, but because it's symmetric, both the top and the right are equally ideal developments from the 4-4 point. And that makes sense because it's symmetric. So how can this help you in your games? Well, let's look at a very simple opening. Whoops. Something like this. Now, the question I have, and that would be useful to think about in your games, is what side of the board is the biggest? A, B, C, or D? If you're playing black, where do you want to play your next move on this board? So, if we're looking at this question, it's best to look at each side and determine which one's largest. So let's start with the left side. The left side has 2 stones that are interested in developing this side. For instance, if black plays well, no, I'm not going to play moves. These 2 stones both want to develop the side. We know the 4-4 point in the upper left wants to develop the top side and the left side. Both are equally good for this point in the corner. But from the bottom left side, this stone primarily wants to develop the left side. It has a secondary interest in developing the bottom, but it's not as large as the left-hand side for developing this stone. Now, what about, so we could say that there are 2 stones interested in developing the left side. Excuse me one second. Excuse me. How about these 2 black stones? Well, the upper right corner, if you put a black move here, it's very hard to think that this stone is somehow developing territory or control over in an area with these 2 stones, right? It's kind of like there might be something ambiguous in the center, but it's kind of a stretch to say that, and it's not really helping to develop these at all. It's mostly only acting to disrupt white's development on the left. Now, what about the bottom side? Well, we know already that the bottom left stone primarily wants to develop the left-hand side, and the bottom right stone also primarily wants to develop the right-hand side, but has less vested interest in the bottom side. That's my foot. So really, we could say the left-hand side has a value of 2 because there are 2 stones interested in it. But the bottom side really might have like half an interest from one side and half an interest in the other. So it really might only have a value of 1. Yeah, it might only have a value of 1, or maybe if you're extreme, you would say it has no value at all. What about the right-hand side? We know the bottom right stone wants to develop the right-hand side, but the top right stone is more interested in the top than the right. It wants to develop the top more. The upper right stone wants to develop the top side and not as much the right side. So we could say the right side might have a value of 1, 1.5, maybe half a value from the upper right, and only 1 value from the bottom right. And the top side, well, we already mentioned that the upper left corner wants to develop equally in both the top and the left. And the upper right stone wants to develop the top. So these 2 stones both have a very strong interest in the top. two other stones on the board, it's very hard to see a relationship for developing territory when it's all the way, or not territory, just developing in general a relationship when it's so far away. So to recap, the left-hand side, we might give it a value of 2 because this is the primary direction for two stones that want to develop here. The bottom side might have a value of 1 because it's the secondary direction of these two stones. It's not the primary direction that either one want to go in. The right-hand side might have a value of 1.5. The top right, it can develop on the right, to the right, something like this, but it's not as good as a move that develops the top for the stone. So we might give it a value of 1.5. Because the bottom right definitely wants to go this way, but this one doesn't really want to go this way. So the right hand side might be 1.5. And then the top side again has a value of 2 because these two stones, the upper left and upper right, both very much want to get the next move on the top side. They both can expand, right? So like say a black move here can expand this area, or if let's say black passes or something and white gets a move here, this expands white's area here. So this is the largest, not largest, but it can develop the stone. So there's an interest for both, and it's the primary interest. So we might look at this and say, okay, the top has a value of 2 and the left has a value of 2. These are the two largest places, but actually one might be bigger than the other. Which one is that? The top side. Why is the top side bigger than, let's say, a play on the left side? So if black's playing, and let's say he plays a move on the left-hand side, then this stone is acting to disrupt these two stones' development. But as I mentioned before, this stone doesn't help develop the other two black stones on the board. It only serves to disrupt white's position. It doesn't help black develop his own position. But what if black approaches the top side, from the top side? Say something like this, which is very simple. Well, you can see that black is expanding his control or her control of the top side, while white is no longer able to play, or it's more difficult for white to venture onto the top side and can definitely not develop there. White can't develop there because their black stones are already disrupting what white would want to try to take as territory. But in contrast, let's say black plays a move like enclosing this corner, and white approaches. You can see fairly quickly that white stone is developing a relationship from this cornerstone and trying to map out the top, while limiting black's development from this stone. So while a black play on the left isn't necessarily bad, it only serves one function, to disrupt white's development, but doesn't help develop his own stone. But a black play on the top side of the board both helps to develop black stones, and it serves a secondary function of limiting white's development. And similarly, if black plays something else and white approaches first, you might see a variation like this, and white has been able to develop a relationship along the top side while limiting the black stones from coming onto the top and making the R16 cornerstone, it hasn't been able to develop in the primary direction that it wants, the bigger side. So for that reason, even though we can say that the top and the left side both might have a value of 2, where those are the interested areas, the top side is actually slightly more valuable because a move there is more valuable because the two stones that occupy the upper left and upper right corner are contesting to see who gets the first move on the top side, because that move will limit the other player's stones and develop the player who moves there first. It'll develop their cornerstone. So it's actually fairly big to be able to get that first move. One other slight topic to note is that, let's say we have this corner position for black. From what we know before, we said that the R16 stone here wanted to develop the top side next. But after you get this enclosure, what's bigger, A or B? Is the top side still the bigger side, or is the right side the next biggest side? Well, we could say, okay, let's put a move at A. These are both third line stones, and then there's a slightly bigger fourth line here. That's decent. And what about a move at B? Whoops, this one. Again, these are both third line stones from the right side, and this one you could say is maybe a little bit better because it's a fifth line stone. So B is slightly bigger than A, but is it really that much bigger? Well, what if we add one more move to the mix? Let's add a black stone here and then add another move. The next move that you would typically see to develop would be this jump. This is 5 lines from the top, but this stone here is only 3 lines, and then this one is 4 lines. So it's kind of like you have a 5th line being mapped out, but then it drops and then it comes back up a little bit. Okay, what about the other option? Putting a black stone here and then adding a move here. Well, if you look at this, it's 5 lines up, and then the other formation is also 5 lines up. It's almost like a complete box, right? This huge box, which is 24 points. And in comparison, this one, you might have sort of a box, but it's not really. It's more like a tray. Typically, people will call this position a tray because it's somewhat flat. And you can't really say that it encloses as much space as the box formation. So even one move is slightly bigger, but 2 moves definitely shows how this corner enclosure would prefer to develop on the right-hand side rather than the top side. Just a little bit of an aside. Okay, so we've talked a lot about direction and what direction to play. Does it really have that big of an impact in an actual game? Well, I'm going to make an exaggerated example with this small opening here. When you talk about opening, you kind of talk about, potential territory, potential, your ability to expand over the board and control your opponent's movements. If you look at this board, both players have made the same amount of moves, but just on sight, it looks like black is controlling 2/3 of the board almost, right? If you can kind of imagine there's a line here that white hasn't been able to cross, and black has been able to stake out very loosely, so white could invade, but still claim the vast majority of the board. White could obviously come in and disrupt black's framework somehow, but even if he does, the framework or position is so large and massive that it's very difficult for white to be able to contest it. And white, if you very aggressively try to come in, can find yourself falling under multiple attacks. There's a group up top that white would have to take care of. There's a group on the right, and black can still make some sort of invasion on the left later too. So it's not like white is necessarily all that solid either. The main thing I want to talk about in this kind of position is because black, let me get rid of these lines. Because black was able to suppress these original cornerstones from developing the way they wanted and maximally developing his own stones. So we could say that by approaching black was able to maximally develop his cornerstones, and then because he got this formation here, so many triangles. Because he got this formation of these 3 stones, it limited white's ability to move further out on the board, right? And by limiting white's for future development, Black was able to take initiative to seize most of the board. And that's kind of the crux of direction of play. Direction means to play in the area that will develop your own stones and limit your opponent's stones. And you're trying to be the most efficient at this, right? Because on this board, Black and White made the same amount of moves, but Black stones are much more efficient at covering the space and affecting the relationships between the stones than White's. Okay, so I think that's a fairly good chunk of information, and I think that's usually where I would stop my lessons when I'm teaching at a club. So I'm going to end this video here. If you enjoyed this video, please subscribe or like it, and I hope that you gained something that will improve your Go or help your Go in the future. And see you next time. Thanks.